Okay, welcome tonight. I'm glad everybody showed up here tonight. This is I believe the fourth in a series. Is it the fourth one we've done? Fourth in a series of interviews and oral histories we've done about the city of Vermilion, with the people in Vermilion. Tonight we have Patty Kishman here, but before that, these interviews are done in the cooperation, with the cooperation of the Vermilion Area Archival Society, the Ritter Public Library, and the Vermilion History Museum. And again, tonight we have at our disposal Patty Kishman from the library, who's going to present the history. She knows everything about the history of the Ritter Public Library, and if you don't have one of these books, Patty's got a few of them here, and there's probably more upstairs if you want to take one and maybe take a few and give them to your friends and relatives. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit tonight about the library. First of all, Patty, who are you?
I'm the part-time communications manager at the library, and I'll just double check. Can everyone hear me okay if I speak like this? So I'm not a long-time resident like some of the other people who have spoken so far. In fact, not long time at all. My husband's family lives in the Vermilion area so long that the roads are named after them. But I only came to Vermilion when I was in the 8th grade, so I'm, not a native. It's been 40-some years, but still.
Have you used a library all the time you've been in Vermilion?
Yes, when I moved here in the 8th grade, I was not a library-going gal. But I do clearly remember, I have 9 brothers and sisters, and when we moved to town, my parents drove us through the downtown and the Pink Library. And at that time, I don't know if people remember this, across the street there was a duplex, and it was also painted pink. And so we were moving here from a suburb of Chicago, and we looked at each other, and we saw that pink library and that pink building, and we thought, oh my word, where have we moved to? But we quickly found out what a nice library it is and what a gem in the community it is.
Okay, tonight I'd like you to talk about the beginning. You've written this book about the library, and if you'd talk a little about the very beginning.
Well, I'd like to start with the beginning of our project. So last year we realized that this was going to be the library's 100th anniversary, and we knew that we wanted to make a big deal about it. And so we thought, well, the first thing we have to do is find out what is the history of the library. We need to put it all together. So we went down in the basement where the library has been collecting all kinds of local history, bits and pieces. There were meeting minutes, there were newspaper articles, cartons of photographs, but the story wasn't all put together in a single place. So we knew the first thing that we had to do was get the story together. So Candy Fisher, who's in the audience, was on the team, and Linda Ernschwender, who works for the library, and I, and Rich, all started putting the material together. We gathered it, and then we started writing it in a single narrative. And so that's what this little booklet is. As we were putting it together, we decided that we would once and for all get it in a single spot so nobody ever had to do it again. And I have to say that as we started, I thought, this is going to be pretty boring. I'm not sure who's going to be interested in it. Maybe a few library people will care about it. But I quickly found that the story was pretty interesting. I always think of the library as being related to George Ritter. It's Ritter Library. But the truth is that the library started well before George Ritter, and it was started by a group of determined women who brought the library to town despite kind of difficult circumstances. And then a really fascinating part of the story is that one of these women, in fact, perhaps the leader of the group, was Rich's grandmother. So maybe you want to introduce your grandmother.
Yeah, my grandmother was born in Minnesota, and her family did a reverse migration. I call it a reverse migration from Minnesota to Milan, Ohio. And in Milan, she met my Okay, there's a photograph of my grandmother.
But when she was older, because the story starts when she was a young woman.
Yeah, she was, initially she was a school teacher. She started teaching school when she's 15 years old. I can't imagine doing something like that at the age of 15, but they got a pretty good education evidently back then. When I go through history and I'm looking at things like that, and I'm looking at some of the people and the things they wrote, you know, their handwriting and everything, I'm absolutely amazed at their abilities compared to what I see today, even from myself. I feel like an idiot. You know, they did other things. They didn't just write or talk or build things like that. They actually built their own houses and made their own food and things like that. My goodness. And then they had schools. Well, she was a school teacher.
And she was pretty young because the superintendent of schools wrote a note to her. Do you want to?
Yeah, this was several school teachers, but she was the youngest teacher in Erie County at the time she started teaching. I do have a photograph somewhere, not like this, but one of her in her one-room schoolhouse in the Milan rural schools. Well, in any case, she came back to Milan with her family, and that's where she met my grandfather. They were married in 1901. And that's when they bought the Vermilion News. But she was always interested in the library system, the need for libraries, and always promoted that along with my grandfather. And then I'll let Patty tell a little bit about how they got together, or how the women got together.
Well, I feel like as we were uncovering the record, you know, all these minutes and newspaper articles that we found down in the basement, I feel like I wondered, because Bessie was the co-editor and co-owner of the Vermilion News, I wondered if maybe her voice had risen to the top, or it remained in the written record because she was the record keeper. You know how that is when you look back in history, you think, well, who were the other people that she worked with? Because there was a group of them. And what I found really interesting was these minutes were kept like back in the beginning of the century, the 1900s about. And all of the women were referred to by their husbands' names. So it was C.G. Schmidt, and I've forgotten what his... Pearl, and that's now considered a woman's name, so it was a little confusing. So I made it my mission when I was writing this little booklet that every single woman would be named by her own name. It kind of chokes me up a little bit because I just really think that was an important thing to do.
Well, I'm glad you really did it that way, because I thought it was always important myself, because women were spearheading the need for a library, and it's very noticeable when you're going through historical records and things like that, that women were always referred to as Mrs. So-and-so, never by their you know, the names that their names. So I'm glad you did that.
Yeah,
it's important.
So one thing we found out was the people who helped Bessie were women who belonged to this club called the Cirrhosis Club. And when I first heard it, I kind of laughed but cirrhosis comes from the word sorority, which is group of women. And so these women were amongst the first people who banded together. Bessie was in the Cirrhosis Club, and they banded together and started a library. So the very first library in Vermilion wasn't a public library, it was a subscription library, and you had to pay $1 to join. And through the newspaper, Bessie encouraged people to pay their $1, take advantage of the books, and they were just a collection of books. Actually, Rich is the one who told me about this. You know, a couple dozen books, and they were kept on the shelf of stores in town. So I think, Paul, we're ready for another slide. This is the Guy Davis Dry Goods store, which was on the corner of...
It's right here.
Liberty and...
where Friendship Park is.
And that is one of the very first places that the books were kept. So I kind of wondered, did the store owners like to have the books because it would bring in more shoppers? Or did they consider the books a pain in the neck and they just wanted them to be, because they moved like every couple months, right? Mm-hmm. They were in a jewelry store.
Well, I think they did bring people in.
It's hard to know. But anyhow, so that was our very first library.
It's very almost ironic that it would have been in this building that was right next to us here. And here we are sitting in the library.
Meanwhile, other libraries were beneficiaries of Andrew Carnegie. So the Sandusky Public Library was established, and they had a mission from the county to provide books countywide. And so some of those books were provided to the group in Vermilion. So that was one place that the early subscription library, that was one way that they got their books, and some of them were donated. And then in 1918, state funds became available to the town, and so our library was formed as an agency of the school board. I don't know if you know this, but some libraries are Carnegie libraries, some are agencies of the town, but our library, it just happens, was established by the school board. So even today, the school board appoints the board of trustees for the library, and our revenue that we get from taxes comes through the school system. And that's our service district as well. So that was 1918. I think we're ready for another slide, Paul. So after they moved the books from store to store to store, they finally found a more permanent home, and it was in the Rudy Mock Photo Studio. So this was 1912? I guess this was in 1918. And they rented space from him. And this studio was?
This studio is approximately, it was just one lot north of where the jailhouse bed and breakfast, which was the first real library that Vermilion had. But that was right next to it.
So what happened was, they were in here in 1918, and from 1918 until, what's the year? 1934.
Yeah.
So what is that, about 14 years, this group of women managed the money and the books. And there was never enough money. They just didn't have as much money as they would have liked. So they held all kinds of fundraisers. Evidently, the Congregational Church in town was pretty active in this, and they had special events, teas and whatnot to raise money. And also, they were very frugal about how they purchased the books so that they would, they were scrimping and saving all the time. And by 1934, they had raised enough money to build a brick building. They built it, it was practically on the site of this. They took this building and they dragged it to the back of the lot. And then they put up, so we're ready now for the next slide. This brick building, which it's still there today, you know it as the jailhouse bed and breakfast. But the thing that I found so interesting about this story is, think of the timeline. If this was built in 1934, 32, 34, they gathered this money together during the years leading up to and including the Depression.
It was actually built by workers who worked for the Depression. It was built by Tischer, Pop Tischer. He was a contractor, also the fire chief in town. But he hired these guys using money from the Depression money to build it. Did a nice job too.
Yeah, I liked the way Rich pointed out some of the details in this photograph, the baby carriage and the lamppost.
I don't know. There's probably a few people here who have been in the library. I know Bruce has been in. Were you ever in that building?
No, I'm not that old.
Yeah. Well, you go in and it's all hardwood floors on the first floor. I have a few pictures of
Yeah,
the
we
interior.
had, the next picture is a picture of the interior, right?
Well,
Well,
that's the
past
Lady
beyond
City.
that, I think
Yeah.
there's another picture, Paul, after, yeah, there it is,
Yeah.
the interior.
It was really nice.
But if you'll go back to the picture of the brick building, Rich pointed out to me that The lamppost in front actually has the word library printed on it. And there's a big baby carriage, and if you look more closely, you'll see there's a little toy baby carriage right next to it. It's really a sweet photograph if you look, or if you have someone like Rich, who is a historian, who can direct your attention to the details.
It's a nice building.
So if you want to go then to the next slide, you'll see these are the gals. These are the ones, and
They didn't swear. Not one of them.
That is, in the front row, Mamie Thompson. In the middle, it's Bessie Roscoe. And then there's Mary Shaw. And in the back, we have Jenny Cole and Mary Black and Addie Rust. So they're the ones. We give all the credit to George Ritter, and we talk about him a lot, but it was these gals.
That was probably their grand opening. That's why all the flowers are around them there. Yeah, that's one of the things that always strikes me. I was in there a couple of years ago just for a few minutes, and the floors are still hardwood. Well, they wouldn't be any different, but they're still very nice.
So they built the building, and that seemed like a great thing. It was a nice big building, and they had plenty of room. But it didn't take long, of course, before they started wishing for something more. Over the next few decades after this building was built, Vermilion continued to grow. In the mid-30s, all the students attended school at a newly expanded brick building on South Street, the school that has just been vacated and turned into the Technical Engineering School.
Vermilion Technical
Vermilion
Institute.
Technical. And the wooden lighthouse at this time that was out on the pier was taken down and replaced by a modern metal structure. The library collection comprised 7,000 items, and it was growing. In the 1940s, you could browse the Wakefield shelf. There were art and music items from the Glenn Johnson Memorial Collection, books about South America on the Pittman Memorial shelf. So I guess that's how they displayed the collection donations.
They had a lot of children's books, too, in the section.
And do you remember going in this library?
Oh, yeah, sure.
So, during this time, Rich told me an interesting story about what was going on. So his grandmother was still involved in the newspaper business, and now your mother as well, right?
Yeah. George Ritter used to come down, and just because it was like a hub.
Well, before you say that, let me just quickly introduce George Ritter. So George was a man who grew up in Vermilion. He was the son of a tailor who immigrated here from Germany, and he went to Vermilion High School. And when he was, he earned his way through college by stringing gill nets. So he was a hometown boy. He got a degree from Cleveland Law School, I think it was called at the time, which is now the Case Western Reserve University Law School. And he married a gal from Wakeman, and they moved to Toledo. But during this time, he was coming back to town now and then. And
I should mention, too, I've been, as I go through reviewing some of the old issues of the Vermilion News, and I'm in 1910 at the moment. At that period of time, George was living in Sandusky, and he had joined a law firm in Sandusky. He was just getting started, but he was also running for office, and I'm trying to remember, I can't remember, it was for prosecutor or something.
it's in here. I have to look to
County
refresh my
prosecutor
memory.
or some such thing. So he was getting his sea legs in the industry, law industry at the time. But he would come in and visit with my grandmother at the Vermilion News, because the Vermilion News was like the Chamber of Commerce in a little town like Vermilion. You come to a town, you look around, and you say, where can I go to find out things? Well, you would go to the local newspaper office. So a lot of people would come in and sit down and talk. Well, he would come down and visit with my grandmother, and he kept telling my grandmother that he was going to build a library in Vermilion. And my grandmother kept after him all the time. Every time he came in, she would ask about that. Well, he was never in a position really in those years to do that. It wasn't until, back after she had died, probably 10 years after she had passed away, that this happened. But she was always after him about it.
So Bessie died in 1946, and that was before the era of the building that we're in right now. But you can't help but wonder, when George Ritter returned to town with his offer to build a library, if he didn't have Bessie's, nudging in his mind when he came back. So 1950s, a new era. World events continued to affect life in Vermilion and progress of the library. And George made a very important move at that time. He became legal counsel. Well, before I tell you the story of George, I used to always say to myself, how'd this guy get so much money to build this library? Like, lawyers aren't necessarily that rich.
How do you know?
So then Janet, does everyone know Janet Ford, our longtime director? She was director of the library for 35 years, and so you're definitely a part of this long history. Told me this story, and I thought another really interesting thing about the library story, first we had this group of women working through the Depression, and now we have this hometown son who, here's how he made his money. So he became legal counsel to the founder of the Willis Overland Company in Toledo. And does anyone here remember the Overland? It was the second largest car manufacturing company in the United States. It was in Indiana, I think, or Illinois first, and then they moved to Toledo, the company did. But they were in dire straits. I think they made some poor decisions, the company did, during the First World War, and the company was nearing bankruptcy. So George, as legal counsel, and two other people who were also employed by the company, perhaps one of the accountants, is that right? Worked to craft a plan that saved the company from bankruptcy. And how did it happen? World War II. Because the single biggest product that this company made, the Jeep. I think we're ready for another picture. The Willis Jeep, which was one of the most important pieces of war machinery. So you might say to yourself, well, that seems kind of bad that the money for the library came from a war. But the truth is, George and the other men who rescued the company saved thousands of jobs that would have been lost if the company had gone under. So it was the Jeep that gave George his fortune. So in it was about 1950s, 1955 or so, that George began his philanthropy. He not only funded this library, but he also funded other things like a planetarium in Toledo and a library, actually the Ritter Library at Baldwin Wallace University, which was his alma mater, and other buildings, the Fowler Room at the United Church of Christ in Wakeman, pipe organ at the United Church of Christ in Vermilion. So they did lots of good things with their money, the Ritter Public Library being one of them. And the library, interestingly, is not named for George Ritter. It's named for his mother and father. George said at the time that he gave a dedication, I'm going to see if I can find quickly the words that he spoke, because I think people sometimes are curious to know what kind of man George was. And what he said when he spoke, this wasn't in Vermilion, it was, I think, at the planetarium. He pointed out that his parents had instilled in him early the belief in the American ideals of equal opportunity for success through integrity in industry, and the responsibility of each person to maintain these ideals for succeeding generations. So I feel like that was kind of, he must have written that out very carefully to use all the important words. But I liked what he said about integrity and industry and the responsibility of each one of us to do something. And he certainly carried that out in his actions. He wanted to honor his parents who, and this is a quote, showed me the opportunities for a poor boy in America. They also taught me that there are responsibilities as well as opportunities, and I resolved to render these certain public services. So I didn't know George, and few of us did, but those are some of his actual words. Janet, you remember George, don't you? No, you never met him? How about you?
No, but I was there when they were dedicated, but I didn't know him, no. But one thing I want to point out, as long as we're talking about George for a minute, and I think Janet has mentioned this before too, that the tailor shop that his dad had was on Grand Street, just a little bit north of where they built the library. And I think Janet tells a story about that painting that's in the, I don't know if it's still up in the room or not, George's painting. I hope I get this right, but when they got that painting, they were still in that library. So George wanted it on that wall, the north wall, because it was close to where he kind of grew up in that era. So that's kind of a neat story.
George's family home is the house that is just north of the soda grill. Do you know the gray house with the white trim and the yellow door?
It's right behind Susco's office there. Yeah.
So, the picture up there. George had it in his mind that the library, he wanted to model it after the Swift Mansion. And this was a building that existed about 7 miles south of Vermilion in Swift's Hollow. Do you know there's Mill Hollow and then there's also Swift's Hollow? So this is an image of what George had in his mind. And another interesting story about the building of this library is that they chose pink marble because they thought that if they had white marble, it might fade over time. So the marble was brought up from Georgia. Did you want to say something?
No, I'm just listening to you.
More than 30 tons of marble came up. It was crated in wood and trucked to Vermilion, along with 31 tons of limestone from Alabama. Each of the 6 columns across the front of the building were assembled from 3 precision machined pieces weighing 3,500 pounds. So you can imagine what this must have looked like in our small town. And the lights came from our own F.W. Wakefield Brass Company. When George came, he was no longer living in Vermilion at the time. He was living in Toledo. But he and his wife came out for a little dedication ceremony. And there's the pediment being put on. And is the next picture, George, at the... Oh, we're not quite ready for that picture yet. We go back to this one. Okay. Well, I guess I'll tell this now. As a part of the ceremony, they laid the cornerstone. And behind the cornerstone, they put a box. And the end of this story, it won't be the end of our story, but there's even a neat ending to the story because in this box is a message from George Ritter. And it was to be opened 100 years after the setting of the cornerstone. So in... Shoot, now I have to look. I'm not good with numbers.
2057.
In 2057?
Mm-hmm.
58. People will get a final message from George Ritter. I don't think I'll probably be here, but it'll be very interesting to hear what he says.
Let's take it out.
No, I think we have to wait. You'd probably be haunted or something if you didn't follow his rules. Okay, so that was the era of this beautiful building. And now we're ready to go on to the next era. So all of a sudden it's the 1960s. And This picture is not from the 1960s, but
Who's this lady with the glasses?
this is our longtime director, Janet Ford, who, what year did you arrive, Janet, at the library? Okay, 1981. Isn't she adorable? I might have gotten my pictures out of order. I think maybe we need to move to the next picture because in the 1960s, the library had about 23,000 volumes. The librarian Dolores Warburton showed a series of travelogue films during the winter months, but by 1966, the collection had already outgrown its shelves. They had built a community room for things like the travelogue program, but they decided that they were going to have to put bookshelves in it. So in 1977, George Ritter returned to the library again, to the Board of Trustees, with an offer to help fund an expansion. So this was only like 20 years later. Talks began for the building of the expansion, but in 1979, Ritter died. So he included the library in his will, and that he asked that the addition that they had already started talking about be named for his sister, Allie, who is also a lawyer in Toledo. So construction began in 1982 on this larger, and does the next picture show the construction? I'm getting my story a little bit confused. This didn't happen right away, right? Okay. So in 1982, they added a second entrance on the north side of the building on Ferry Street. Do people remember that when they put that entrance in? There was a small community room, and a new skylight joined the old section and the new section together. And when George died, he not only left money for the addition, but he also named the library as beneficiary of his will, and continues to provide income to the library in perpetuity. In 1985, his generosity through this trust enabled the library to purchase its membership in the CleveNet organization. Is everyone here familiar with CleveNet? It's a consortium of 44 library systems across the northern tier of Ohio who share resources. So because Ritter is a member, if you ask for a book, you have access to the collections of all of these libraries. Your access is not limited to just what's on the shelf here, but what's on the shelf in all these libraries. So if the Ritter doesn't have it, we'll get it for you. We have a transit system that ships our books out to other CleveNet patrons and brings in books from other CleveNet libraries every single day. So the power of your Ritter card is much greater than what you might have thought it was. And we're very lucky to belong to it because, the library is the 5th library to join CleveNet, the 8th, and now there are 44 libraries. And it costs something. The Amherst Library is not a member. So it's a real benefit, and once again, we owe our thanks to George for making that possible. So after the Allie Ritter edition was made, what happened next was technology. So by 1990, the building, computers were starting to arrive in a big way, but our building was not wired for technology, nor was there a practical division of the space. So it was decided that the library had to be expanded again, and at that time, the entire library was moved. The building was closed down, and the entire collection was moved to the Valley View Elementary School on Beachview. Do you remember that happening? I think there are probably a lot of people here. Do you remember that?
That's what that photo shows.
Yeah. So I think, do you want to move it to the next? And there they are. I have some funny pictures of the staff in jeans unloading all the boxes over at the Valley View School. And the collection was there for a year. Is the next slide? So I wasn't sure, is this the 1990 or is this the 1980s? You can see the skylight at any rate. This is the back side of the building. Before we had, there was an entrance there first. If you'll go to the next slide, I think it shows it better. They redid the whole back side of the building, and the next one too. Oh, and there's the Board of Trustees. Do you recognize some of those people? There's young Linda Wakefield, Sue Sheldon. There's Larry Riddle from Riddle Funeral Home. And the next slide too, please, Roger Watkin. And there's the curved back entrance that was built. So I think you can go to the next one. Oh, and then this was our, this was the 1990, right? Do you remember that? That I remember very well. That wasn't that long ago. We had the information desk on the first floor. Okay, so now, who remembers that building? That was the old Dick Baker Dodge car dealership. Do you have anything to add about the history of this building?
It was originally built by Walker Motors. They sold Chryslers, of course. Some very interesting cars. Walker also owned a lot on the left side of the photograph there. And on that left side at one time was a blacksmith shop. Well, when the blacksmith left and Walker bought the lot to use for a used car lot, and the library wanted to build the library at that time. And Walker wanted a used car lot, so they got into a big hassle about that. But the library finally paid him what he wanted for that lot, and the library ended up with a lot, and Walker ended up with the car dealership. He did have a used cars, was selling used cars on the other side of the building after that. I have a funny story about this when Dick Baker had this. I bought a new truck from Dick Baker, and they had the garage part in back. And one day I was at the church and I was working at the Congregational Church, and I noticed my turn signal wasn't working. I thought, well, the thing's burned out, I'll go home and fix it. Well, when I got home, I figured out you needed a special tool to get the lens off the taillight. So I brought it down to them, and they rolled it into the garage. And guy on one of those boards, because he looked at it, he couldn't fix it, so he got under a board so he could slide under the truck to look and to see, what was going on. Well, he rolled under my truck, and he rolled right back, and his face was white. He said, "There's a woodchuck in the motor." And the woodchuck jumped out and ran up the side of the library.
I think it's kind of fascinating to think about the blacksmith shop became the car dealership shop, and I guess in a small town, that's how it goes.
Well, originally the area was a livery, horse livery, and they sold cars.
So I think the library had its eye on this building for a long time, knowing that if they were going to expand in the future, this was the space that they were going to need. So they bought it in 2002 and used it for about 4 years. It was not library quality space, but it was good for lots of things. I put this picture up on Facebook today, and somebody said, "Oh yeah, the community band practiced there for years." And we also had the community art show there for years. It was a great big, we had the book sale over there. It was a good, it was kind of the transformation of the library from the old-fashioned library where people just went to get a book or to look something up to the library of today, which is more of a community center.
There was at least one Archival Society meeting over there as well. So it functioned just kind of like this room is right now.
So I think it showed a lot of foresight on the part of the library board to acquire this property. But it was old, and it was drafty with those great big windows. And eventually the library had to ask itself, do we fix this space up? Do we put a new roof on it, or do we insulate it, or or do we just tear it down? So I actually was working for the library at that time, so I was I participated, as Janet did, in the effort to go out into the community and find out what people wanted to do. Would they support this, tear this down, add to the library? You know, it was going to cost the town something to fund it. So in 2007, the issue was on the ballot, and the town approved an expansion. And I tell this story, it's the timing was very interesting. So in 2007, it's hard to remember back to how we were feeling then, but the town was optimistic enough to approve an expansion like this. And we knew we needed it because of technology, computers. We had some random computers on the main floor. I think we had 8 of them. And we knew that wasn't enough, that the internet was going to be the way to access information. And if your library is about accessing information, well, then you've got to, you know, have a computer lab. So 2008, the economy crashes, and suddenly things are not looking quite so rosy. 2009, we start construction, and by 2010, when we opened the library up, people had not only lost their jobs, they were losing their houses. So the big library is going up, and I think that it's fair to say it's a big library for a small town. And I want to say, and I'm going to get a little choked up again because I always do, but at that time, we said to ourselves here at the library that we were going to prove our value to the town and to the people of the town every day because people were in need. So it is a big library, but I think it's the place where people go in our community now when they need help. Again, the library has kind of changed over the years. It used to be a place where it was, people who like to read, or not necessarily persons, and they have their nose in a book and they like things all quiet and orderly, and let's have all the shelf, don't touch things, don't take books off the shelf. But now, the library is the place where people go when they need help. Especially as people are not involved in churches as much as they used to be. The library is the single place in a community that is secular, nonprofit place to turn when you have a question or you need help with something. So providing help for people when they need it is a big part of the mission of the library today. Yes, we still have books, and the books might be digital, but you can still get every kind of book you want, especially because of our CleveNet connection. But it's also a place where you go when you need an answer. So we take that very seriously. So that's not the end of the story. I want to say, too, that in addition to being, here's an interesting picture. Who remembers this? When we dug because when we added on in the 2008-2009 construction project, we built this basement. So first we had to dig a giant hole. I just remember that it seemed so big. I always wondered a little that little house next door wasn't just going to fall in. Let's see the next one. Do people here remember this construction? There they are, starting on the second floor. To this day, we have people who don't know that we have a second floor. We have a second floor at this library, everyone. And there we have it. With our, the library also earned, we were the first public library in the state of Ohio to win a gold award for leadership in energy and environmental design, LEED. And it was a very deliberate choice on the part of the library board and administrators. They knew it was going to cost a little bit of extra money, but they felt like as much as having the building be environmentally sustainable. They also wanted it to be a model in the community for green building designs. Now, LEED is something just in the 8 years since this building was completed, it's become an industry standard. But at the time, it was going out on a limb a little bit and we got the designation as the first public library in Ohio because of the foresight of our board. Are you having trouble seeing what that is? It's the rain garden out front, which is one of our green building design features. And that's, you know, before they put the grass on it. We have a rain garden, we have a cistern, we have a green roof on the second floor. We use gray water inside the building, and we have lots and lots of environmental designs that we're very proud of. So, I don't know, you're right, that's just what it looks like. I don't know what that is. And there we are in our glory today. So, I want to say that two things. In addition to putting together the library history, the library last year, as we were planning our centennial, we also decided to make a gift to the community. And the gift is making the local history of our town accessible through our website. So over the years, the Archival Society has been partnering with the library, and we have been receiving tons and tons of stuff. The Garden Club gave us their club ledgers. Families will donate albums. We have all kinds of records down in the basement, but they're just sitting down there. And like, you can't go see them unless you make an appointment and go down there with someone who knows where to look. But I guess I have to give credit to Janet again. When she retired as our longtime director, she organized a group of volunteers to go down into the basement, and they began an earnest effort to catalog all this material. So they're digitizing it. You know, you scan it and you make a digital record. And we also invested in this professional software for cataloging. And this material, bit by bit by bit, is being cataloged and made available. Here, Paul is showing us, so that you can go online, anybody can, from anywhere, and look at it. So I'm not a professional librarian, and I thought, well, this is a little dry for me. I'm glad to know it's there, but I'm probably not going to be able to figure out how to go into this software and look it all up. So we decided that in addition, we would make little story collections. And if you look at this page, you'll see these are the collections that we've made. There's the library history, the story that I just told you. If you want to click on it, Paul, it'll just give them a little example of what you can see. So you don't have to go to the professional search site. You can go here, and it's a story, and you can click over there and get some more information about the Joseph Swift Mansion. You can click on another one and see about the Willis Overland. Oh, there's the picture of Bessie and her family. Did you know that was there?
No.
And if you go back out, you'll see that there are other interesting story collections. The people of Vermilion. We just want to give you an idea of what kind of material is down in the basement. So we scanned some of these photographs. Well, we're not really sure who all these people are, what the circumstances were for the photograph. We have the photograph, and we're hoping that people will look at them and maybe email us and give us information if you have it. I'll tell you the truth, I think the pictures are interesting even though I don't know who they are. They're just really interesting. Here's the class of 1909. Hattie Needing and I bet they didn't think so.
It's photoshopped.
Basketball team. And hopefully, as word of this gets out and people start looking at the pictures, they'll begin emailing us, and we can all work together on compiling our local history. So the other collection are the buildings of Vermilion. It's the same thing. We've got all these pictures of all these old buildings, but we don't know the history behind them. And of course, Rich, if everyone doesn't know this, is the proprietor of the Vermilion History Museum. And because he has access to all of his family's archives from Vermilion News, he is the person who's got so much of this information. And so our centennial year planning caused us to make this formal partnership between the Archival Society, the History Museum, and the library. And together with the people of the town, we're going to have our local history written down someplace where everybody can see it and add to it also. These conversations that we're having, these oral history series, it's going to go on for the rest of the year and also next year too, because there are just so many, many stories that people have to tell, and we want to get it down so that we don't lose it. Some of the people that Rich has interviewed are in their 90s, and if we don't get their history quickly.
I should mention, I didn't at the top of this, is that next month it's going to be Diane and Dave Rathman here at the library.
Their family owned a grocery store that was where the Small Town Sweets, is that where it was?
It's
No, not
Margaret.
small. But what's it called now? It begins with an S. Simple Pleasures.
There's nothing there right now.
You know the little yellow restaurant that is across the parking lot from the old Prague? Well, the Rathman family had a grocery store there, and Dave and his sister Diane are going to have a lively conversation next month about.
Mr. Rathman, George, that had the store, his house was, the library sitting on the place where his house once sat. I used to mow his lawn for 50 cents a week.
Well, I need to check my notes, which are over there, to make sure that I said everything that I wanted to say. But will you go back out to the front page of the website? Thank you. Oh. So if you look at our website, when you first go to the website, this is what you see. And I think a lot of people are, especially people our age, we're not accustomed to the whole layout of what you see on a website. And people forget, scroll down, because so if you scroll down just a little bit, when you... This is above the fold. Aw. I want to say Paul learned that from me. Anyhow, these 4 boxes here, each one you can click on. If you click on the one that says research, it'll take you to all of the databases that the library makes available to you through our CleveNet connection. They're real valuable research resources. And if you look at the one below, the Stories of Vermilion, that's what we are calling our local history collection, and that's where you find it. So if you click on there, that'll take you right to this page. And also, if you type it in the search, the little search thing at the top, you can find it that way too. Does anyone else want to ask a question about library history?
I wanted to ask Patty, what was her maiden name?
Traina. Like train with an A at the end. So I worked when I first graduated from Ohio State, I have a degree in journalism and public relations, and I worked for the Lorraine Journal, which at the time was a different newspaper than it is today. I was the Vermilion reporter, and then I was an editor. And then I was home with my kids for about 10 or 12 years, and I saw my youngest get ready to finish high school, and I thought, oh, I better find something to do. And I applied for lots of jobs and didn't get much response. And then I saw that the library was hiring, for the first time ever, they were going to try out just for a short period of time to have some sort of marketing specialist. And I ran down here with my resume, and I felt like the luckiest person on earth. After all those years at home, I did not necessarily have the skills that were needed at the time, but Janet took a chance on me, and you know how sometimes you have one really lucky thing happen to you? Maybe not everybody does, but that's the one lucky thing that happened to me. I was 1 minute away from just saying, oh, I'm out of the workforce for too long. I'll never, have a job again. And not only did I get a job in my field, but I got a job working for a place that I actually really care a great deal about. I'm not faking it when I say how important I think libraries are. So that was my one really lucky thing.
You know, Janet's never said it out loud, but I think I've heard her mumble she regretted it.
Too late now. I've outlasted her.
I want to make a comment about libraries and librarians. My experience with libraries and librarians over the years has been excellent. I can't say enough good things. One experience I had was right after the 9/11 attacks. Attorney General Ashcroft wanted librarians, maybe the librarians remember this, to give them all the information of people who were going in on their computers, and the librarians refused to. That took a lot of courage on those ladies' part to say, no, we're going to defend public privacy. And I was really impressed with that.
You know, I want to add to that, because today I feel like libraries have to kind of defend themselves because people say, nah, I got my internet. You know, as long as I have my little, I don't need the library for internet. Until the day you do, because you lose your access for whatever reason, divorce, you lose your job, or maybe just to level the playing field for people who can't afford internet access on their own, or just for the day that your computer breaks. But so we're constantly having to defend ourselves. But you just brought up a really important thing that I think very few people think about today. The library plays a vital role in American democracy. We as Americans are free to access information like no other country. China limits access to the internet and information, and many other countries. But because we have libraries where your right to access information is unlimited, we don't filter, we don't track you, we don't turn over your information to people who ask for it. So I am grateful that you brought that up. I like to make that point whenever I can.
The other experience I had was more recently after the recent election, presidential election. I was over at Oberlin, and they hosted a fake news conference. Andy Young was there from the Chronicle, along with a professor of journalism, and it was hosted by the Oberlin Library. And they were going into discussions, what's real news versus fake news, and it got pretty heavy. And leave it to a librarian to straighten everybody out on this. And that's the other thing I like about librarians. They always remain in a neutral position. They go by, this is this book about this, or this is about that. They do not try to editorialize it. And we're sitting there going into this heavy discussion, and the librarian says, well, if you really want to talk about fake news, the polls is a good example of the fake news. And everybody said, why? Well, they're predicting that Hillary is going to win, and they did. So that's a good example of fake news. Yeah.
Candy?
I said to several people, a couple of years ago, I was in the country of Spain, and I asked the person there, who is a resident of Spain, about public libraries. Wherever I go, I ask about public libraries. And she said, oh, several years ago, we decided not to have public libraries anymore. After all, we have the internet. So let's not take our libraries for granted. They can disappear if we are not very, very supportive of them.
I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here. I assume that you're all library lovers. But people forget that, you type in a search question in the internet and you get a bajillion answers. But when you go to the library and you use our special research resources, databases, you get a carefully curated answer. not a bajillion random answers, half of which are being funded by some for-profit group.
Excuse me, to your point, another a very positive experience. My youngest daughter was going to Miami, Ohio. Mary Jane, my wife, and her went to this antique shop in between the freshman orientation, so I had nothing to do. I'm a World War II buff, so I went to the library and I was looking up for President German generals. I was looking in the library. And the thing was amazing. The last time I was in the library was when I was in college. And whenever the librarian would approach me when I was a student, they would kind of eye me, make sure I'm not trying to steal a book, you know. Anyway, here I am older, and you get respect for age. This guy comes up, he happens to be the head librarian, and he helps me out on my research, finding the right book. And at the same time, he says, oh, by the way, I'm having lunch with Dr. Baird. You care to join us? I said, who's Dr. Baird? Well, he's interviewed German generals and so forth and written about World War II. And so they invited me to lunch.
Wow.
I mean, it was just fantastic. Yeah.
Who paid?
Yeah.
Who paid?
But yeah, I paid, believe it or not. But he talked about interviewing these German generals when they're still alive. And there's two experiences he mentioned. One was at first they wouldn't say who because they really thought he was from the CIA who wanted to find out how much they were involved with the Holocaust. And then the other one was, which is kind of interesting. He was interviewing this one guy, and he lived in this apartment on the Rhine River, and the sun was setting. It was a beautiful view of the Rhine River, and this German general was reminiscing. You got to look at it from both sides, you know, what this gentleman said. He said, you have to forgive me. I just was thinking back. He said, at one time, we had it all. And they did. At the start of the war, Germany did have a lot of talent. And then you go through what he went through, after the war and so forth. And that's what history is. You got to stay neutral on it, you know.
Well, and the other thing that you're pointing out is libraries are a place where people get together. Like, it's not so random that you happen to be in a library and you meet people with common interests, and then you are open to each other because people at libraries are people who are interested in finding out more. And I think that's another hidden value of libraries, that especially in this world where you can go to the mall or you can stay home, we need our libraries as a place where the community gets together and we share ideas or we just share our common experience.
Having gone to Waldo and Wallace, I thought, Ritter libraries were everywhere. But there, I used the library a lot because I was earning my way through college, and sometimes I couldn't afford books, and I could go to the library, and they stocked all the books that were currently being used in classes so that I could go there and read my lessons there when I couldn't afford to buy books.
Well, libraries level the playing field. I think even people who never go in a library because they can afford to buy their books at Amazon or used to be able to go to the bookstore. But it is a great way of leveling the playing field. And the other thing is, this is my little stump speech when I talk to people about the value of a library. It's prepaid, right? You've already, so all you have to do is come in the library one time and borrow instead of buy, and you got your money's worth. And if you come in, you might find out interesting things like run into somebody you have a common interest with, or find out that we have a puzzle that you can work on. But that's an interesting point that Paul's bringing out. Yeah, the people who are downstairs volunteering to go through all this material and catalog it are coming up with really great, they're putting together all the pictures of the Vermilion flood. So soon we will have that to offer. So check back on this page, and also we'll let you know when we put new material on it. So the last thing I wanted to say was, our centennial celebration goes on throughout the year, in addition to the oral history series of programs, which are every second Monday, and they're going to go on through the summer. After Rathbun's, we have Rich's sister, who's going to talk about local history. And then we have Janet is going to talk about Linwood, which I think people will find very interesting. There will be lots of pictures. And Don Parsons is going to talk about life on the Vermilion River. He's a longtime marina owner. That'll be in September. In July, you are all invited to a free community-wide picnic that the library is putting on as its sort of our big birthday party celebration. So it's going to be July 22nd, which is a Sunday, in Victory Park. The Lions are going to be grilling hamburgers and hot dogs, and we'll have some activities for the kids. And after the picnic is over at 6:30, Emily Keener is giving a free concert in the gazebo. So I hope we'll see all of you there. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you, Patty.